Bryozoans, one of the most abundant modern phyla and one of the least well known, and also one of the most abundant groups of fossils in the Paleozoic, but still poorly understood. They're mainly known, in fact, for not appearing until after the Cambrian. But that may also not be true. However, there's a lot more to know about these things, so here's a little introduction. Hello again. If you go wandering around any modern coastline, particularly around the UK, I haven't been everywhere else, but I'm sure pretty much everywhere as well, you will find piles of seaweed and other stuff, debris just washed up on the strand line. And in those piles, you will find a large concentration of things that look like seaweed until you take a close look. Now, it's so abundant I don't normally bother picking it up, but I'm sure I do have a little bit of around here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Right, I got a bit. So this is, in fact, not a seaweed. If you put this under a microscope, you'll find that it is made of not a single sort of object, but thousands of little pores, tiny cells connected together. So we can have a look at that. And those cells are the remains of basically little houses where individual animals once lived. It's not a seaweed, it's a colony. And there are many, many different types. Even around the coast of Britain, there are dozens of species. And some of them are quite delicate branching things, others are flat sheets, others are encrusting onto hard surfaces. So there's a lot of diversity there. But most people don't actually notice that they are anything other than bits of seaweed. So, in contrast, if you go back to the Silurian seas, you will find that there are seafloors in the sort of limestone areas which are covered in fragments of shelly stuff. Sometimes it's a bit more than a fragment, and you have lumps like this, where, if you look carefully on the surfaces of this thing, you will see that it is covered in little polygonal cells. And those cells are, again, the same structure. It is the openings of tiny little tubes that all form together to create this mass, which was a single colony of animals. And they are rather like corals superficially. They're not like corals at all in detail, but they, in terms of being a colony of very small animals which are combined together in a great big calcite skeleton to make something that can actually form reefs, then they are a bit like corals. The animals are quite different, but they're superficially, again, they're not that dissimilar. You've got little sort of blobby, elongate, soft-bodied thing with a crown of tentacles, which it filters stuff out of the water with. So there's only so many ways of making a living if you're a large colony like that, and normally it involves sitting on the seafloor and catching whatever drifts past. Now, occasionally, of course, you accidentally capture some sort of fungal disease, which I do apologise for my appearance at the moment, but I've been adding some sort of ointment, so I'm hoping it will go away at some point fairly soon, because it's actually quite uncomfortable. Anyway, where were we? Now, the thing with the fossil record is that most animals, of course, do not get preserved. They are not, under normal circumstances, going to have a chance of being fossilised because they rot away, they disarticulate, they fragment into tiny pieces. And in order to have a good chance of ending up in the fossil record, like we see in the Ordovician and Silurian and Carboniferous and many other times in a huge abundance, something like a bryozoan has actually got to have a massive skeleton of something that will preserve. And that something is calcium carbonate, calcite. So this is a biomineralized skeleton, in the same way that a mollusk shell, for example, is biomineralized. And this gives it a chance of being fossilized because it's already made of a mineral. It's something which is already effectively a rock. It's still got to be buried in the right place, not dissolved and not washed around so much that it gets smashed into pieces. But you have a high chance of at least getting fragments. And so you can quite often see that when you look at a slab of the Wenlock limestone, for example, there are lots and lots of tiny bits all over the surface, many of which are actually bryozoan. And you get this in quite a lot of deposits when you start looking. The small pieces can be quite delicate and fragile and quite hard to spot, but they are there in abundance because these things were made of calcite. And that is a little bit of a contrast to this sort of stuff, which is not made of calcite, at least not entirely. It turns out that this one, Flustrofoliacea, is actually made of something like 85% calcium carbonate, and yet it's flexible because the rest of it is organic. So it has a chitin-based skeleton with all sorts of other biopolymers in there, which give it a flexibility. And if that organic stuff were to decay, I suspect that means that there wouldn't be a lot left of the organism as a fossil, that the rest of it would fall apart because it would only be small bits of calcium carbonate, despite the fact that it creates, in total, the majority of that. It's quite different to a massive calcite skeleton which is solid. There are some calcareous bryozoans out there. There are some that we find sort of encrusting things, and there are also some extremely delicate ones, which you get in other parts of the world, which are made of calcite skeletons in exactly the same way as some of these ancient Paleozoic ones. And they are gorgeous structures. Let me just give you a view of one of those for a minute. As you can see, it's a lacework of calcite, and the holes going through it are not where the animals lived. The animals were inside these branches that anastomose, they sort of divide and join back together again. But the branches themselves are hollow and made of a whole series of little tubes. And you can see the openings of the tubes in some of these areas. They're often quite hard to spot because they're very small. But the whole colony was made by thousands of little individual zooids, the animals that were constructing it. And when you zoom into a few places, you can just see that there's sort of tooth-like openings with a little spine there where there was an animal having the aperture of its little zooecia, as they call it, sticking out into the seawater. If you look at one of these branches end on, where it's broken through, you can just about make out that it is hollow. It's got these little tubes running through it, but it's quite a complex internal structure. And this is actually quite an annoying detail because that internal structure, and in fact the structure of the calcite walls between the little tubes, is rather important in terms of taxonomy. Which means that anyone who actually studies fossil bryozoans almost invariably will turn their nose up at anything that doesn't have that internal structure. As we know to our cost from many, many a time that we live in an area in the Bill Thin Layer where you don't get any limestones. What you get are rather nice moulds, external moulds usually, of the skeletons of bryozoans. So you get things like this. Now, these can be really quite nice fossils, and they can be recognizable as a particular species, just from the form of it, the pattern of the zooecial openings, the pattern of the branching, and so on. But you can't really do much more with them. You can't say which major group, which families, for example, of bryozoans they belong to, unless you already know from a specimen in limestone, which preserves the internal detail, the internal structure that you need to do proper taxonomy. And that is frustrating if you can't do that, which is why most bryozoan specialists just won't really touch anything preserved as external moulds. Now, occasionally you do get in the Bill Thin Layer something which is not really a limestone, but a calcite concretion. So a lump of calcium carbonate that has grown within the sediment, often quite rapidly, and preserved things with calcite skeletons inside them. And there you can start to see the sort of detail that you really want to be able to look at in order to do the taxonomy. And some of these can be really lovely things. They're just beautifully geometric. Once you've cut through the surfaces, sliced and polished it and varnished it, you can see all sorts of remarkable detail in there. And one of the odd features, which is a known characteristic of quite a lot of well-preserved bryozoan colonies, is that in the individual tubes where the animals were living, you get things called brown bodies, which are thought to be some sort of degraded remains of the digestive system of these little animals. They didn't have a good specialized excretory system because they're such tiny little organisms inside a colonial structure. So what they end up with is a sort of concentration of the waste products of their digestion in a sort of concentrated package. And that appears to be what the brown bodies represent. There's been some work done on the isotope geochemistry of them, and so there is a reasonable amount of information about these, and that does seem to be what they actually are. And so even that is quite interesting because you can see that in this one there is a ring of these brown bodies all the way around the edge of the colony, just set back inside. So that's where the animals were attached, and then they would reach out with their little tentacles to feed and then pull it back in again for safety. So what are bryozoans? Well, they're one of the groups of animals that we haven't really looked at on this channel at all. We've done quite a lot on the very earliest ones, like sponges and cnidarians to some extent. We've covered some deuterostomes, and then the rest of the bilateral animals, the bilaterians, are divided into these two major groups. You have the ecdysozoans, which include things like arthropods and paleosclechidan worms, which again we've covered quite extensively at different times. And then there's the other group, the Spiralians. This is a very broad group that includes quite a lot of familiar things, like mollusks and annelid worms and arrowworms and gastrotrix and flatworms and quite a few peculiar sort of offshoots of this part of their evolution. But at the top of that little bit of the tree, there is a group called the lophophorates. Now, their exact interrelationships and so on we can go into another time, but there is a general consensus now that there are 3 closely related phyla, of which 2 are very closely related and 1 is the sister group for those. So the 2 closely related ones are the bryozoans and the phoronids, and they are the sister group to the brachiopods. Now, many of you will probably be very familiar with brachiopods. They are another of the most abundant groups of fossils out there. They have these phosphatic or calcareous shells, appeared in the early Cambrian, still with us today. But in the Paleozoic, they dominated a lot of shallow marine ecosystems, at least in terms of what has been preserved. The other 2, the phoronids and the bryozoans, are slightly less well understood, although, as we've seen, bryozoans are in fact everywhere. Limestones from various times, but especially the Ordovician, Silurian and Carboniferous. The phoronids are basically soft-bodied. They are a relatively obscure group today, and they are mostly, or in fact almost entirely, solitary little animals. Some of them bore holes into limestone or into shells. Some of them burrow, but they are basically little sausage-shaped things with a lophophore. This is where we get the name lophophorates from. It's something which is shared between all 3 phyla, and it is a bilaterally symmetric array of tentacles arising from 2 arms. So you have a pair of soft arms, each of which gives rise to lots of tentacles, and it is that structure overall which is called the lophophore. And it is used for filtering particles out of the water, and it does so very successfully too. Now, they work on different scales, so the biggest brachiopods have been really quite large, and they're things like Gigantoproductus giganteus, which obviously was tiny, about that sort of size. And then you have the bryozoans, where the individual animals are obviously much less than a millimetre across. Now, the brachiopods have a fossil record that goes back to the early Cambrian, as I said. The phoronids, despite being completely soft-bodied, also have probably an early Cambrian fossil record in a thing called Iotuba from the Chengjiang biota. The bryozoans, now they're a bit more peculiar, because despite the fact that they have such a robust skeleton, we'll come back to that, which fossilizes in abundance from the Ordovician onwards. There is no definite fossil record from before the Ordovician. Early Ordovician, they appear, diversify spectacularly, become really abundant. Cambrian, no definite examples. Great big caveat, there was a recent news story which we'll look into soon, different video, but sometime soon, about a thing called Protomelission, which has been sort of bundled around from one group to another from the early Cambrian, but now a recent paper suggests that it is indeed a Bryozoan. But we'll have a good close look at that one in a bit. But certainly up until a few weeks ago, it would be fairly safely said that there are no Cambrian Bryozoans known. So the question is, why? How could that be? And we have this extensive fossil record from the Ordovician onwards. How could they left no trace in the Cambrian? Well, the answer to that is because not all bryozoans are equal. You remember these things? Made of chitin. They also tend to live in very shallow aerobic water, often within the wave zone or just below. And so it depends on which groups of bryozoans have a chitinous skeleton and which of them have something which is calcite and could therefore fossilize. And when you get into the taxonomy of bryozoans, it is a very peculiar picture and very different to what you might expect from the fossil record. There are three classes of bryozoans, all three of them still alive today. These are the Phylactolemmata, the Stenolemmata, and the Gymnolemmata. All lovely things to memorize and trip off the tongue so easily. But the Phylactolemmata has a single order, the Plumatellida, and these are exclusively a freshwater group. And they're also gelatinous masses, they're soft-bodied, they don't have much of a chance of fossilizing. The Gymnolemmata have two orders in them, the Ctenostomatids and the Chylostomatids. The Chylostomatids are mineralized, but they don't appear until the late Jurassic. So in terms of the early fossil record, there's not much chance of seeing anything of the sort. The Ctenostomatids are more interesting. They are not biomineralized, but we know that they go back to the Ordovician at least, because some of them actually are borers. So they grow over the surfaces of calcitic substrates and actually etch their way into it. They have a sort of chitinous or gelatinous sort of form, but they can leave traces in particular shells. And I say particular shells because they have a very strong preference. Now, I hardly ever see any of these. I mean, they do occur occasionally, but you don't see them very often. But the ones that I have seen in the Ordovician have been only on a single genus of brachiopod shell. A thing called Macrocelia, which has quite large flat valves, and it has a branching network of little tubes over the surface which are etched into that surface of the shell. And Macrocelia seems to be a preferred sort of substrate for it in quite a lot of other places as well. I think I've seen it reported from the US in the Ordovician. So it's a peculiar thing that they have obviously a very deep history, but then a very precise sort of specialism or preference for where they live. But because of that, we do see ctenostome borings, and they are recognizable, quite distinctive things going back quite a long way. Some of them are also freshwater. So this is a swan mussel shell that we picked up in, or something like a swan mussel, in a dried up reservoir in China. And you can see on the surface of this a whole range of little chains of rounded units. And each of those is, of course, one little zooecium, which the animals lived inside. And you can see these chains are sort of branching and the colonies getting bigger by occasional branches, and then the chains carry on growing. And you can see the apertures where the animal would have extended through just above the base of the next one in the chain. So these are rather lovely structures. They would have been little chitinous, organic, membranous sort of arrangements of things on the surface. They weren't biomineralized, and these obviously dried out and mostly disappeared. But they're quite delicate little things living in fresh water. And you can certainly see the similarity of these modern ones to the chains that we get etched into the shells of brachiopods in the Ordovician. Some ctenostomes are completely different though. This is a thing called Alcyonidium. It's basically a little shriveled up, dried up blob now, but this would have been quite a large gelatinous mass, which has then shrunk as it's dehydrated. And that mass is covered with little pores, which you can see under the microscope, and those pores are where the individual little bryozoan zooids were coming out. But the colony itself is this large sort of squishy lump. And occasionally it's bryozoans in the form of large squishy lumps, albeit in the phylactolomata, these freshwater ones, that can generate a bit of a news buzz every now and then. Occasionally they do really well and start multiplying in lakes and rivers, and you can end up with these strange sort of gelatinous lumpy blobs floating around and giving people a lot of confusion. Because if you'd never seen one of these before, you would really not immediately perhaps think of bryozoans as being the culprit, if you'd ever thought of them before in your life for that matter. But in any case, quite often that's what you've got. They were even speculated to be the answer for a really weird pulsating blob that appeared in the sewers in North Carolina, I think it was South Carolina somewhere, where it turned out that it was actually a bunch of tuberficid worms, but this sort of pulsating sort of activity that was going on in this weird blob is something that you also get with bryozoans. So it was a plausible scenario for a while, but nah, tuberficid worms, unfortunately. Then you have the stenolomata. Today there is a single living order, which is the cyclostomatids, and those are mineralized. And they go back quite a long way, I think, to the Ordovician again. But more interesting, perhaps, is that there are another six orders of stenolomate bryozoans, all of which are biomineralized, and all of which go back to at least the Devonian and almost all of them to the Ordovician. So it's an extraordinarily rich record of extinct groups of stenolomates. Now, most of them went extinct around the Triassic or the late Paleozoic, Permian, Triassic, one or two into the Devonian, but they are dominantly a Paleozoic group which basically got hit really hard in the end Permian mass extinction, like many things, but in this case, 6 out of 7 of these mineralized orders just vanished around that sort of interval. Maybe not in the extinction itself, but in the time around it. And this is quite interesting because it explains why the bryozoans are such a spectacularly successful group in the Paleozoic, because what we're looking at are one relatively minor group today which had diversified into numerous orders, all of which had a massive calcite skeleton and then went extinct again. The range of form that you get in these bryozoans is extraordinary, and one of these groups, the Phenestelida, is just really beautiful as fossils. And we've got a lovely one here that was very kindly provided from Scotland, from the Carboniferous, by Gary Hoare. Thanks, Gary. And just have a look at this. It's just beautiful. So we have this sort of filigree network of little struts all joined together. You can zoom in and see the detail in these things, and it's just an exquisite fossil. And there is quite a wide range of these, and we have early ones in the Ordovician, and in the Carboniferous, these phenestelids or fenestrate bryozoans become really quite common. The name comes from the French for window, of course, fenestra. So you have a really lovely array of these things. But then there are other types of bryozoans, some of which I am yet to fully identify. I mean, there's this rather lovely thing that we have here as a network encrusting onto a bivalve shell from the Silurian of Herefordshire. And I found this when I was way back as a teenager, but I've never quite found another one, and I've not quite pinned down what exactly it was. But this is very similar in appearance, but it's actually encrusting onto the surface of this bivalve shell. so I'm not totally sure what to make of this one. And there are many, many others, all these stick-like forms, which are the really common ones, and you get really delicate things and really quite robust ones. So some of these are large and rather chunky fossils. Yep, that's a chunky fossil. But because all of the three classes are still alive today, we can do things like molecular phylogenies and work out which ones were the primitive group and which are more derived. And you might expect, therefore, that the stenolemates are the ones that have a good fossil record going back to the Ordovician, that they should be the primitive one, right? Well, when you think about it, that doesn't make much sense because we don't have this Cambrian record. And it turns out that the first of those three classes to branch off, the first branch to appear, was actually the phylactolemates. This is the ones that live in fresh water, have no skeleton of any significance, and yet they apparently were the first group to branch off. Now, it's not true that they have no fossil record, because there are things called statoblasts, which are sort of chitinous protective structures, which go back to about the Permian. And it is thought that these are an adaptation to surviving in the very unpredictable world of fresh water, where things just dry out, you get rapid temperature changes, and it's a much more unstable world than living in the sea. But these statoblasts only go back to about the Permian. So it looks like the shift to freshwater happened around the Permian, and they had marine ancestors going back to presumably the Cambrian, like every other phylum, and yet they didn't leave any fossil record because they had no statoblasts and they were soft-bodied. So you end up with this kind of topsy-turvy sort of evolutionary history where the things that are apparently the earliest have all gone extinct in the marine realm and just took over in shallow water instead, some 250 million years later. Instead, some of the later groups came to dominate the marine sphere, and then those also mostly went extinct in the end of the Paleozoic. And then you got some other groups diversifying in the shallow water, including calcareous forms like this, which are still thriving today. But it's mainly the less heavily mineralized forms, the more flexible ones with at least a significant component of organic material in the chitinous material within the skeleton, that dominate today. And these are the ones that would leave much less of a fossil record. Well, that's all very well, you might be saying, but why should you care? I mean, aside from them being just gorgeous fossils and all the rest of that sort of stuff, they are actually, because of their abundance and various attributes about the way they live, extremely important in the history of life. Obviously. Most things are when you come down to it. But Bryozoans in particular have, at various points, actually been one of the dominant forces in constructing shallow marine ecosystems, to the point that there are multiple stages during the Phanerozoic when you have bryozoans forming reefs, which then provide extensive habitat for all sorts of other things. Now, I know a lot of people are probably thinking, but reefs are made by corals, and today that is mostly true, apart from the ones that are made by hexacnelid sponges or red algae or, in fact, bryozoans. And there are various groups of organisms that have made reefs in the past, and they've been very successful at it. So you have entire ecosystems that are based around a dominant flame builder, which is the thing that cements onto itself to create a massive structure, usually with cavities in, so they have lots of other things living inside it. And of course, in the modern marine realm, the reefs are the most diverse habitats that we have. So there are actually different groups of bryozoans have been responsible for creating reefs. So in the early Paleozoic, it was mainly the trepostomes, things like these big batostoma colonies that formed these structures in the Ordovician around here. Then you have the fenestrates, these fenestellid things, these beautiful lacework ones, which have been quite important reef formers in particularly the late Paleozoic, sort of Carboniferous and Permian. And these can be not just relatively small things like that one, but there are some we saw once when we were undergrads who'd taken on a field trip to the El Capitan Reef in New Mexico. And there the structure is composed largely of massive bryozoans and sponges forming, well, the bryozoans sort of growing up and then sideways and forming large cavities underneath them. And because these were solid calcite skeletons, it actually forms a solid structure that they then grow on top of. Because bryozoans, like many other reef builders, need a hard surface to attach to. So what you end up with is, once it's started, one bryozoan will grow on top of another one, and then if they are the dominant group rather than sponges, you have a bryozoan reef. And it's not even a thing of the past. So there were bryozoan reefs after the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. In Faxe Quarry in Denmark, there are blocks of chalk like this. And, well, the entire quarry, which is about a square kilometre, is basically a reef habitat. And in this case, all of those little sticky things that are binding it together and actually creating the fabric and generating these cavities inside by supporting the framework around them, they're bryozoans. And there are lots of other things in here as well. So there's bits of crab, for example, and snails and all sorts of stuff. But you have an entire ecosystem that is dependent for its basic architecture on bryozoans. And it was only recently discovered that these bryozoan reefs are actually still alive today. So there are some off Australia where you have a major sort of framework construction going on by bryozoans, which is then producing a different sort of Great Barrier Reef, but not quite as big as the Great Barrier, but still quite impressive structures. And in this case, of course, it's the cheilostomes. Those are the modern ones that form, or some of them form, the solid calcite structures. So the question with any sort of reef building thing is how do they get going in the first place? Because if you have a sort of shallow marine seafloor with waves moving everything around, and you have a lot of bits of debris, is that enough? Does it need to be something which is solid on the surface that creates a stable surface that the bryozoan can attach to? And the answer to that is pretty much yeah. I mean, you do get spherical bryozoans, things that have been growing onto a surface which then becomes a slightly more active environment and it gets washed around. So you have ball-like bryozoans where they are still alive, but they're being washed around constantly. Sort of tumbleweed bryozoans, basically. But what sort of nucleus could they have? It can be almost anything, but one thing that we found in the built-in layer here, in the Ordovician, is that, obviously, it all goes back to sponges. Now, one of the things about sponges is that they have a large-scale skeleton made of spicules. And these spicules are made of silica, so they're quite sort of tough material, basically quartz-like needles. Hello, Bob. Sorry, he always wants to get in on the action somehow. And occasionally, what you find is when you have a high abundance of these sponges, after they die, the skeletons break down and disarticulate. And in the largest species, these spicules can be that sort of length, 10 centimetres or so. And so these are being washed around on the seafloor. And I think everyone wants to get in on it today. I'm not entirely sure why, but there we go. So they're being washed around on the seafloor and they can actually start interlocking to form a solid sort of meshwork on the seafloor, which stabilizes it. And you can see the effect of this when occasionally you can look for bryozoans in the rocks around here in the Bilthin layer, middle Ordovician stuff. And what you find is that the Bryozoans are dissolved because we don't have limestone, so it's normally in sort of silicified sandstones. But the spicules are not dissolved because they're made of silica, so they're stable. So you can look at these little Bryozoans and find that in the base of them there is a spicule. This is not uncommon, and what you find is that the base of the colony, where it first started, has grown around a sponge spicule. So you've gone from a mobile, wave-dominated seafloor where there's lots of movement and a very unstable environment to colonization by sponges, which can produce an abundance of spicules, which then disarticulate, stabilize the seafloor, and then other things like Bryozoans can colonize. And these can then form the basis for other groups. So in the early Paleozoic, in the earlier part of the Ordovician, there were no coral reefs. This is something that evolved around the middle to late Ordovician, really. The first corals that actually formed reefs were kind of late Ordovician. And then you have a sort of ecological succession. So you can have the Bryozoans forming a sort of basis, and then the corals evolve to take advantage of this, and you have stromatoporoid sponges doing a similar thing, and suddenly you've got the Silurian patch reefs of the Welsh borders. And similar sort of things have probably happened after mass extinction events in particular, because sponges thrive after mass extinctions, it is known, and they are thought to potentially have helped the succeeding ecosystem, the recovery phase of the ecosystem, to recolonize, because they stabilize the seafloor, and particularly after the end Ordovician mass extinction, the recovery of the ecosystems was remarkably rapid, despite many, many lineages being wiped out. And it seems to have been potentially to do with this ecological effect that sponges help to create the conditions where other things can take over. And foremost among those other things, in many areas, seems to have been Bryozoans. So that's not a bad thing to have on your CV, really. Sort of saviour of the world, that sort of thing. That probably is overstating it, to be fair. But I think it is quite an important role. And because they're a group that is not very well studied in comparison with things like corals or even brachiopods, they tend to be a little bit overlooked in terms of their ecological implications. And I think probably there is a lot more to that story still to be told. And nobody's really focusing on that at the moment, but as a sort of intervening stage between a sort of turbulent sea floor and something which looks like a reef, whether it's corals or something else, I think they're quite significant potentially. So it gets particularly interesting when you start wondering where they are in the Cambrian. Because there were Cambrian reefs, but there weren't Bryozoans, as far as we know, kind of. I will be doing a follow-up video on something called Protomelission, which has been in the news recently based on new papers, and which may be a Cambrian Bryozoan. But presumably this is a taphonomic issue, that for whatever reason, whether the Cambrian ones were not colonial, not large enough to be found, not preservable because they only had a soft-bodied sort of architecture. Possibly there were calcitic things, but they were only partly calcitic, and therefore when they decayed, they just disintegrated. But probably there wasn't anything like, the really hard Bryozoans that formed reefs later. Or if they were in very localized places which we haven't found yet. But when you go back to that evolutionary history of them, it does seem that the earliest branches of Bryozoans, which are, remember, very, very close morphologically and evolutionarily to the phoronid worms, didn't have a recognizable skeleton. So there probably was this early phase of evolution throughout the Cambrian in which there was just no chance of them being fossilized, that they had probably most of the ecology of later Bryozoans, and possibly even they were the sort of thing that could stabilise seafloors, but they couldn't really leave much of a trace and they couldn't create permanent structures. But they could have been there helping other things to establish, potentially. It's basically a bit of a missing history, and that history must have been there, and there must be some trace of it left. So what we're going to look at in the next one is Protomelission and what it tells us about the origin of Bryozoans and possibly their early history and what gaps it requires there still to be. Anyway, that's Bryozoans in a nutshell, and we will get onto their relatives at various points as well, but this is a really interesting group that shouldn't be ignored or forgotten about. But quite often, Bryozoans are just neglected, and they shouldn't be, should they? They're lovely, really. And if you ever want a little bit of a natural history challenge, go and see how many different species of bryozoan you can find on your seashore, washed up on the strand line. Because once you start looking closely, I'm betting it'll be quite a lot. What are you waiting for then? Off you go.